Good afternoon. First I'd like to acknowledge my brother Damien the Minister. I think it's good to have you here. I'm not sure. I'm sure you'll report back to my mother at home on how I do. I'd also like to acknowledge Doug Leader, Chairman of the Regional Council. Your job will always be difficult going forward, and I think we as young farmers understand that. So it sounds like you're leading in a great way. So, as you've been told, I'm Bede. I farm in Westport. I milk 330 cows with my partner Angela on the family farm that Dad actually came to over 60 years ago, and I purchased off him in 2011. So that's where I am. I'm basically a hands-on dairy farmer in Westport. My topic was around the internal growth of the Chinese dairy industry. So what I wanted to understand was whether Chinese dairy farmers could greatly increase their production and whether that would affect myself as a West Coast / New Zealand dairy farmer. And that was where I started. But we should go back to when I was announced as a 2015 Nuffield Scholar. It was actually in November 2014. At that time, the New Zealand dairy industry was in a great place. Fonterra had just paid $8.50. That's right, $8.50. I don't know whether many of us remember that figure. At the end of 2014. The industry was confident. We felt that we had helped rescue New Zealand from the GFC, and we really were proud of being part of the dairy industry. 12 months later, the Fonterra payout was $4.65. How the world changes. And I think from that point on, the dairy industry has changed. But as we look forward, there's a couple of things that we need to check on. We start by looking at what we've exported to China. And this really comes back to my subject. To China in 2008, we exported $500 million worth. Doesn't sound like a lot. But in 2013, New Zealand exported $4.5 billion worth of dairy products to China. That is what's driven our industry. We should note though, in 2016, that dropped to $2.5 billion. That's quite a substantial drop, and I think us who were dairy farmers really felt it in our back pocket. But we need to understand also that the effect it's had on the dairy industry in relation to the dairy debt. 2003, dairy debt was at $10 billion. 2015, dairy debt was close to $40 billion. That's a huge amount of debt for our farmers to carry, and we need to understand that that is putting pressure throughout the industry. So in 2014, before being announced the Nuffield Scholar, I actually travelled to China with Westland Milk Products as a director. And that was where I decided that I needed to understand more about the dairying in China. And these are some of the observations that I made. First, you have to understand the cow numbers, okay? So 2003, the China national dairy herd was 4.5 million cows. By 2007, it had rapidly risen to 8.7 million cows. And there's a number of you here that will have made some money out of exporting cows to China, I'm sure, during those years. But then something happened, called the melamine scandal. We're all aware of it, but we saw the reduction back to 7.1 million cows. The scandal caused the government to become involved more in the dairy industry. And from that, they removed a number of farms of 20 cows or less. And this basically accounted for the reduction in 1 million cows overnight. That was driven by what we now call biosecurity risks, and just by trying to make a better food chain, a more reliable food chain. Since then, the cows have increased again, And we're looking at numbers now currently around the 8.5 million cows. China has some limiting factors, and this is what I was trying to understand, was what happened inside the gate in China for the dairy farmer. And those limiting factors are related to increasing production. And the main thing that I noticed when comparing the housed cow operations from elsewhere in the world to China was around their per cow production. China's per cow production is at 4.2 tonnes of raw milk per cow. Europe's average is 6.4 tonnes of raw milk per cow in a similar housed situation, while the US is 10 tonnes of raw milk per cow. So a very small increase in the per cow production could see quite a great increase in the actual total production for China. So what are the factors that are limiting the Chinese per cow production? There are really four. And really, I had to dig deep for some of these to get them from people, because people tend to think that things are going great and they don't want the behind the gate practices to be investigated. But when I did dig deep, the first one was the feed quality. Basically, poor feed. Now, one commentator said to me that there is a requirement to lift per cow production in China of 8 million tonnes of high quality feed. Most of this is imported either from America, in some cases Australia, in the form of either lucerne or high quality soya. However, the current supply is estimated to be 3 million tonnes. So that is where we can understand the difference between what the European and Americans are doing and what the China is doing per cow. Now, we took this picture on a farm. This is an example of the low quality feed that was being fed to lactating cows. It's really dry cow tucker at best. It's just not, we picked it up, we looked at it, we smelt it. I wouldn't even feed it to my dry cows. And this was what they were milking on. So this explains the feed quality issue. The next issue was around labour and skills. The Chinese are happy to run a 100-cow farm, but to transition, I think as we've found in New Zealand, those skills to 500-cow and 1,000-cow operations is not easy. And really they're not there yet. So that has caused issues as they've expanded their dairy industry. The second issue that really took me by surprise was I thought the labour would be cheap when you're running a dairy operation over there. While the per unit cost of labour was cheap, the labour that we saw on farm was far in excess of anything I'd seen in any other farming operation around the world. I think I just talk about one example. We went and visited a 1,600 cow farm and they had over 100 staff. So, I mean, that just shows you. So it means their total cost of labour is actually a limiting factor to expansion or to increasing the per cow production, because their cost of labour, when we looked at the figures, was actually quite similar to ours in New Zealand. Thirdly, I looked at the problems of genetics. The problem is the Chinese want a cow that not only milks, but also produces good weight for beef. So they want to be able to switch quickly. When dairy returns are low, they want to know that that cow will return a good beef price. So therefore they're compromising their genetics. They're breeding not like we do for BW and PW and really just full milk production, but they're actually breeding for a cow that if the price of milk drops, they can put it on the hook and get good returns for. And I can tell you that compromises milk production. And as you'll see further along, the per cow production has actually stagnated for a number of years in China. The final one, environmental. I know how everyone's starting to like that word in this room. But even in China, the public are demanding increased environmental standards. We're aware of this, but it is really starting to impact on the dairy industry. A number of the farms we visited were close to populations, and their actions were now being traced by the public. So they were having to change how they were dealing with their manure and basically the general smell that a housed cow farm produces. The thing is that while dealing with these environmental problems, and I think we've felt it in New Zealand, the capital used to deal with the environmental issues will stop money being spent on increasing production. And so in the next 3 to 5 years, there'll be a large amount of money expected to be spent on farm in China around environmental issues, and that will be another barrier to the increased per head, per cow production. So I observed these things and I thought, what effect will Chinese production have on my farm and my fellow dairy farmers? That was what my Nuffield topic was about. Milk production in China in 2003 was only 17 million tonnes of raw milk. By 2008, it had grown to 38 million tonnes. After melamine, it came back to 27 million tonnes. But again, it grew again, and by 2015, it was at 37.5 million tonnes. But as we know about poor prices, so do they. So poor prices in 2016 saw the level drop to 35 million tonnes. So I've given you facts, I've given you observations, but what does this mean for New Zealand dairy farmers? I conclude in my study that the risk of the Chinese internal production growth would affect demand for New Zealand dairy products is very low. And I have confidence that this will not be a limiting factor to the success of my dairy farm or the New Zealand dairy industry. And really, this was something I didn't understand before I undertook these studies. I knew they had lots of milking cows, I knew they had lots of potential, but was it going to affect me on my farm? No, my conclusion was not. That we can carry on, I don't know whether the Labor Party will let us carry on, trying to produce more milk, but we can carry on. Okay. But there are some cautions. China has gone from being 0.7% of the global gross domestic product to 30% of the world gross domestic product in the last 30 years. So if a country can do that in 30 years, if they really wanted to increase milk production, I'm sure they could do it. So what do we need to do? We need to follow what's happening in China closely, and I say we need to get behind the gate and understand what is happening on the Chinese dairy farm more regularly, because this will endow us with knowledge that will see us well into the future. And the final conclusion, I think, and I think it's very relevant now, as many people in this country are dealing with China, is that we have to develop relationships. The better relationships we develop, the better we will be off. And just investing in relationships between China and New Zealand, whether it be in the dairy industry or any other industry, is money well spent, because those relationships are seen as long-term guides to the future, and relationship development in China is really valued. So they are the two things. Have a look at what's going on behind the farm gate and keep working on relationships. Finally, I will acknowledge Nuffield New Zealand, because they certainly supported me through this Nuffield, and I'd also like to acknowledge Nuffield Australia for the work that they do around our GFP. Many of you won't have experienced the 6-week tour that I did, but it is one of the highlights of my life, really. 6 weeks looking at farms across 10 countries. I just know how much money and effort Nuffield Australia have invested in that, and I really feel that that should be acknowledged. Jim Gelch, I don't think's here, but many of you will know him from Nuffield International, and he certainly has been a real driver behind that. I'm very impressed by what he's achieved. Then I'd actually like to acknowledge Angela, my partner. I own my own dairy farm. If I'm not there, someone's got to step up and make sure it's all going well, and that was Angela, and her support through this has been tremendous. And I mean, I know Damien's talked about my father, but yeah, he's been a big influence, and my mother, and I know how much they enjoyed the Nuffield community. So thank you.